your hand up if you think that we should have a policy of zero pollution. Zero pollution policy. How do you think that's a good idea? Zero pollution policy. Is that a good idea?
Yeah.
Think about it with yourselves. Yeah? More hands going up? Okay. Who thinks it's a bad idea? Interesting. About half and half. Okay. So, let's say we do get this policy implemented of zero pollution. Now here I am, hiking through the famous Rocky Mountains of British Columbia, and I've got my little granola bar, and I'm enjoying it. Tastes like soap. This sucks. But I go to put it away in my pocket, but oops, the wind blew it. You ever been up in the Rocky Mountains? Very windy. Wind blew it away. Rocky Mountains have cliffs, they have valleys, they have rocks. It could be anywhere. Those of you who said we should have a zero pollution policy, put your hands up again. Zero pollution. Now we have some pollution. How much resources should we spend going after this one little rapper somewhere out in the Rockies? You got an idea?
We shouldn't make the rapper in the first place.
Shouldn't have made the rapper in the first place?
Yeah.
Well, we did.
We should make biodegradable rappers.
But that's too late now. We have this rapper. It's out there. This rapper is out there. It's pollution. What should we do about it? We have a zero pollution policy. What should we do about this? Yes?
Punish the person who littered.
That's one way of approaching it, punishing the person who littered. But we still have the pollution. Does that fix the pollution?
No.
What do we do about this pollution? We have a zero pollution policy. Ideas? Yes?
If somebody finds it somewhere, then they should pick it up. Or make a policy that if you see pollution anywhere, you have to pick it up.
So that's a pick-up pollution policy. But we have, what if nobody, it's big mountains. Those big mountains, yes.
What if you were to do a cleanup policy, like how we do for the oceans?
Mm.
So you have a group of people, and they go either voluntarily or you pay them, work out whatever way, and they go.
So we would have a cleanup policy, but that's a cleanup after there's pollution policy.
If there is.
If there is, and then how many people would you delegate to go finding one rapper in the Rockies? 1? 100? 1 million? Yes.
Okay, I feel like I'd like to send out lots of people to go find that one rapper in the mountains because we have a zero pollution policy, but that's not realistic. I feel like so that rapper might be lost in the mountains now.
Yeah.
Because I don't have all the money to spend on saving that one rapper.
Yeah, you don't have all the money.
Yeah.
And yes.
Well, assuming you're alone, if there's a zero pollution policy, you'd be in trouble if you polluted even by accident. So it's in your best interest not to tell anyone.
Oh, that's another issue. So if we do have this punishments policy of breaking our zero pollution policy, and then I did pollute, how much incentive do I have to report the pollution? Right? Have you guys heard of shoot, shovel, and shut up? Yes? There's all sorts of wild animals that are protected for one reason or another by the government. If one of them comes onto your property and is destroying things, what are you going to do about it? They're destroying things, you can't do anything legally. So, what some people have adopted is a policy, a personal policy, of shooting the animal, shoveling it underground, and then shutting up about it. So, These are choices that you have to make as a policy maker. How much policy or how much pollution are you going to allow? And the optimal amount of pollution might not be zero. You might have to put up with some pollution. It's not just pollution, by the way. It could be crime. What's the optimal amount of crime? Is it zero? How are you going to enforce it? How are you going to enforce zero crime? Little police drones following every single person with a laser gun pointed at your head constantly? You got to think about if you have a zero pollution policy, how are you going to implement it? Today's topic is choosing in groups. How's this look? How can we choose in groups? Let's put up. So you're in a group. Choosing in groups means you are in a group, and as a group you have to come to some sort of group decision. How many possible ways can you do this? I'm going to suggest there are 2 ways. Yes?
Can you vote?
That's one way. And the alternative is a...
You have a discussion until everyone's convinced.
I'm going to say you have a group discussion, voting, that's a group discourse. The alternative way is a dictatorship. Right? Either one person decides, or many people decide. Okay? So the choice is between many and few. And the few could also be a dictator. That's one person. Let's talk about voting. So we talked about majority vote. That's one way. You can also have minority vote. What could minority vote be? Yes?
Whichever idea has the most support, not necessarily the majority of the support though.
How do you distinguish between most and majority?
If like there's 5, if there's like 6 people in a group, one idea gets 2 votes and every other idea gets 1 vote.
Why would some ideas get more votes than others?
There might be more than one person that aligns with, that the idea aligns with.
I think you're on the right track. Somebody want to give a restatement of this idea? So, we have a system where, say, one person, one vote. In some systems, some people get more than one vote. In the stock market, it's however many stocks you have, that's your vote. The more stock you have, the more votes you get. You can buy your votes. Right? So that's one way of doing things, or I guess 2 ways. So we have a one person, one vote, or one person, many votes. Which version do you guys think is better? One person, one vote, or can you buy votes? What would be better? What would even better be? What does it even mean to be better? Okay? That's a question you should think about. What does it mean? What does better mean? Better to your interest? Better to the group's interest? Better to some other group's interest? What's the objective? What is better? Have you heard of the tyranny of the majority? The tyranny of the majority. This is a problem people allege is can be found in democracies, especially democracies with one person, one vote. Then you have whatever 51% of the population says goes. And a funny example is some people say democracy is 2 wolves and a sheep voting on what's for dinner. Right? That's one way of interpreting democracy. But we talked about last week the problem of special interests, rational ignorance, concentrated benefits, and dispersed costs. In a democracy with a large number of people, are most people going to be incentivized to learn every little nuance and detail about every little thing up for voting? No. So we have some people who spend a lot of time learning about some issues, and others who are just trying to get by. They'll get their information from a other source, secondary source, sometimes even tertiary source, right? So a primary source is the guy who came up with the idea. A secondary source is say a newspaper reporting on what the guy said, and then a tertiary source is what your friend read in the newspaper about what the guy said. How many of you actually read the newspaper when there's some policy going on versus some tweet about what other guy tweeted, right? Ordinary sources. You think you're informed because you know what a guy said about what another guy said about what some other guy said? Think about it. Most countries do have a majority voting system, though. But also, we've also developed something called a constitution. So what is a constitution? Anyone with an idea about a constitution? Constitution. What does that word even sound like? Constitution. Yes?
It's a set of rules and policies set out at the infancy of a national collective that kind of defines the values of that.
Yeah, so policies set out at the infancy of an organization. So England has a constitution, but is it written or unwritten? Do constitutions have to be written? That's another question. I see nodding heads. Anyone say they don't have to be written? Yes. They don't have to be written. Why?
Well, some countries are just, like, think about like Europe, for example. Like, their history just goes so far back, like it's just not possible to have a constitution that was written 2,000 to 3,000 years ago and have it still survive, right?
Yeah.
It's mostly just like spoken or written, well, oral communication, right? Passed down through the generation.
Right. In England specifically, they do talk about a constitution, but England is the most famous example of a country where they don't have a written constitution. It's implied throughout all the common law rulings over the centuries. What the United States did in the 1700s is that they said, let's write down these rules for a constitution at the beginning of our government, and let's see what happens. Are countries the only entities that can have constitutions? Who says no? What's another entity? Religions, they can have a constitution. Anyone else? Yes? Businesses can have constitutions. What do we call those? What do we call the constitution for a business? We typically call it articles of incorporation. Right? And when you have those articles, you spell out certain things. And all constitutions have these 7 things in common in order to be good constitutions. You can skip a few of these and then you'll have some problems later on. But here we go. Ready? 1 is a source of sovereignty. Source of sovereignty. Why should we trust this institution? Sovereignty is a fancy, highfalutin word for right to rule. Right? Typically, when we talk about sovereignty, we talk about countries being sovereign over their own people. But you can be sovereign over your own decisions. And some of you are sovereign together, and then you get together, you form a corporation that has its own sovereignty. Your source of sovereignty could just be your contract between you and your buddies, starting a t-shirt selling business. Second, some rules regarding membership. Who gets to be a member? Do they have to buy shares? Do they have to pledge an allegiance? Do you have to do a little song and dance? You need some rules about who's in the club and who's out. Why would you want that? Because you're going to be spelling out obligations to the members. The members have to do some things by virtue of being members. It could be voting once a year. It could be cleaning up after events. It could be promising to follow all the rules. Right? Any questions so far? We're halfway through this list. Once you have those obligations, you need to make a domain. The domain of the institution. What is the area which it controls? What are its boundaries of rule? Right? Can it make rules on who you can marry? Can it make rules on where you live? Can it make rules on how much money you can make? That's the domain of the institution. What are its own limits? You then want to get into decision making. Who gets to make decisions for the organization and how? The United States Constitution was the first that had a separation of powers. They had the legislative branch, the judicial branch, and the executive. Right? Many corporations, they have a board of directors that has a chairman, and then they have management. They make different decisions. They have different roles and responsibilities. Part of the decision-making process is amendments. An amendment is a change to the rules. So you set out some rules at the beginning, and now some time has passed, you realize some of these rules aren't working anymore. How do we change these rules? We call those amendments. Questions so far? Questions at all so far? The last thing is exit. How can you get out of this organization? If you're a partner in a corporation, you could have to be forced to sell your shares, or you could have to relinquish your shares altogether without any compensation. In the United States, many people thought that the idea was that each individual state joining had the right to leave at any time at will. In fact, New York and Massachusetts each threatened, they call that secession. Each threatened secession several times. And then in 1861, the southern states actually did declare secession. They thought it was in their power. But it wasn't written anywhere in the Constitution who could do it, when, and why. It wasn't written, but everyone just assumed that they could do it. Abraham Lincoln, president of the United States at the time, didn't like the southern states seceding. So what did he do? He did some things that ended up in a big war. And now everybody says because the southern states lost that war, therefore no state now has the right to secede. That's the argument now. They say the secession argument is over because we had a war over it. questions on this? Yes.
So who wrote these rules for the rules? Who came up with this?
Yeah. So no. So this is economics, right? So these rules. Social scientists have been studying constitutions for several hundred years, and over these centuries, these are the general rules we've observed as being the best ones to have. Yes?
On your list, members don't have rights.
I can't hear you, sorry.
Members don't have rights on your list.
Members don't have rights?
Yeah.
Membership, right? So so there are some obligations. You could have some rights. What constitutes membership? And then part of what constitutes membership could be some of the rights that they have. Yes?
If England's constitution is unwritten, how do they determine if they're following it or not?
Because they have case law where they talk about the Constitution. So they say, oh, in these previous cases, we've talked about the Constitution being X, Y, and Z. And so in this case, we're following these other cases. That's precedence for now the Constitution has to be similar like that. Yes?
Why wouldn't they have just written it at some point in their law?
Because that's a good point. Writing things down can be a tricky business. So when the United States, they have the Constitution, they also have something called the Bill of Rights. What's the Bill of Rights in the Constitution of the United States? You all hear about it all the time. I know you've heard about it. Who can tell me what it is or maybe what's in it? What's in the Bill of Rights? Yes?
What about like the right to bear arms?
The right to bear arms is one of the things in the Bill of Rights. There's also the right to freedom of speech and religion. What are these things usually called, though? Yes?
They're the first few amendments.
They're amendments. So they had a constitution, and then immediately amended the Constitution with 10 amendments. The first one to free speech and religion is that's the First Amendment. The right to bear arms is the Second Amendment. And there was a big debate at the time whether they should include these amendments. Because some people were saying, these amendments are so obvious that we shouldn't bother including them. Others argued that if these notes are so important that they should be written down somewhere so we don't argue about these later. We don't get into the minutia later. Right? And if you're following the gun debate in the United States at all, you know that the Second Amendment is a huge deal. Every time somebody wants to regulate guns, others come by and say, well, we got the Second Amendment. If the Second Amendment wasn't written down, it'd be harder to argue for the Second Amendment. The right to bear arms, the United States did not invent the right to bear arms. The right to bear arms was recognized as a constitutional right from England. But it wasn't written down in England. The Americans decided to write it down. Writing down things is hard because you could get the wording wrong. If you've ever tried reading the Second Amendment, for example, it's got some weird commas in there. It's not clear what it means on a first glance. You have to read the history of what they were trying to write at the time. And even in different copies of the Constitution, it's not written the same way. That's a problem too. Questions? Comments? Concerns? Yes?
So if they were trying to revoke the Second Amendment, how would they go about it? Can they do it?
They would have to amend the Constitution. And they've done this. You've heard of prohibition in the United States. That was introduced via an amendment to the Constitution. And then later, they amended the Constitution, making the previous amendments invalid.
And who has the authority to do that? Who has the authority to amend?
So the amendment process for the U.S. Constitution is complicated. There has to be, everyone has to be involved, including all the individual states. Right? So it's a complicated process. There was another amendment, I forget what it was. But the most recent amendment was just 20 or 30 years ago. And it was basically started by someone who had gone to a high school, I think, or a university class, and they thought something was an amendment, but it wasn't. So he went and one by one got all the states to ratify this amendment to the Constitution. I'll share that story in the sources for this lecture. It's a good story. Yes?
So if the amendments were to prevent arguing over like things, but you can create an argument to change the amendment
Yes.
whenever you think it's appropriate, what's the point of the amendment?
It makes it hard to change these things. It's just, it makes it more difficult. It's an added cost to change. So you don't get a dictator coming in and deciding to change things willy-nilly. They say, oh, we have this constitution now and it's this, we're spreading out the power, right? So this is what we're doing. Yes?
Does that mean it have to be unanimous amongst like all the states for them to change things?
In the United States, it's not unanimous. I think it's either 2/3 or 3/4 have to ratify it, but it doesn't have to be unanimous. Yes, but that could be a rule that you choose. You could choose that rule that it has to be unanimous consent, but it doesn't have to be. Yes.
There's a whole argument about the letter.
You gotta speak up, sir.
Isn't there like a whole argument about the letter of the law versus the spirit of the law?
Yes. So
How would that impact amendments? Like if these are written with a certain goal in mind, like would it be possible to tweak the actual wording of it without having to change the amendment itself?
yes. So the question is about the letter of the law versus the spirit of the law. So you could, words change meaning over time, right? One argument against the Second Amendment, for example, is that at the time the right to bear arms was, rifles and muskets. But now we have automatic guns and nuclear weapons and other catastrophic instruments of war. So we should restrict rights on those grounds. And then others argue against that argument by saying that the spirit of the Second Amendment was to prevent the monopoly on violence of the state getting too powerful. So it was to empower the citizens against the state. That was the spirit. The letter has changed. The spirit, we have to preserve the spirit. That's long-standing battle of constitutional authority and law. I saw a question in that area.
No, I was going to ask the same question too, like how many people have to...
Sure. Let's talk about, you're choosing in a group. Some people in a group have more powers than others. In a corporation, it could be the president of the corporation. In a country, it could be the president of the country. They get a lot of power. They can't handle all that power and responsibility on their own. So what do? They delegate their power. Part of the constitutional process has to be rules around delegation. Can the President of the United States delegate when to fire a nuclear weapon? That's a question. Can the President of a corporation give his secrets away to his wife? That's another question. Is delegation in a state the same as delegation in a corporation, as a profit-seeking corporation? When you're president of a country, you have power of violence over other people. When you're the king of a country, you have power of violence over people. When the king of a country delegates his power to a duke or a lord in some far-off corner, what he's essentially making is a local duke, or local king, who has all the same powers of violence, but then who must answer back to the supreme leader. In a corporation, when you open different branches and you assign different branch managers, is the branch manager, do they have the same power as the presidents of a corporation? No. The branch manager has a job, and that job is to make money. If they're not making money, they're liable to get replaced. If they are making money, they can still be replaced if they're, jerks about it. But the important thing is that they're making money. They're creating value for the corporation. But in a government organization, those who have been awarded jurisdiction of some area, and it doesn't just have to be a physical area. You could have, the Service Ontario are the ones who hand out driver's licenses. The person behind the counter, they have all the power. They can decide to hand you your license or not at any time. When you go across the border, the people at the border have more power in some sense than the presidents of the country. They can deny you entry, they can hold you without charge, they can hold you indefinitely, they can seize your belongings. Who elected them? Those are huge delegations of power. And I mean the use of force when I say power like that. That the state has just delegated to arbitrary people. Some people call them bureaucrats. Some people call themselves civil servants. But you have to understand, they have power. Whereas the branch manager of a corporation, of a bank, they can turn away your business, but they don't have the power to commit violence. Who's heard of, so we talk about enforcement of might makes right. Who agrees might makes right? 0 people? Who agrees? 1? Really? Who disagrees? A few. Who's unsure? Most are unsure. Fair enough. Might makes right. We're arguing about 2 + 2 = 4. I say it's, you say it's 4. I say it's 3.9999 continued. Who thinks I'm right? 0 people think 3.999 is the same as 4? Interesting. But if you and I have a disagreement right now, if you beat me up, if you take a gun to my face and you shoot me, does that make you right? Does that affect the correctness of that position? No. We talked about rights in the previous classes. Some people think they come from God. Some people claim that they think that they comes from the government. But we know that those same people don't think that anything the government says has to be true and valid. Nobody takes that position. So we all have rights outside of government, and we know that government is the use of force. So we can have rights outside of the use of force. But if we're making a contract, and a constitution is a type of contract, how then can we enforce this contract? Do we have to enforce it by the sword, by bayonet point, by gun point? Is that the only way of enforcing contracts? Who says no? Yes, sir. You gotta speak up.
There can be civil discussion.
Civil discussion?
Come to a mutual agreement, stick to a plan, do it.
Sure. So we could have a civil discussion, but we still disagree. I claim that these crutches are mine. The gentleman here with the cast on his leg claims that the crutches are his. Is the only way of solving this through force? You say no, we can also have a discussion about this. We can involve a third party, say this person, and then they can adjudicate. Who's got a better claim to the crutches? Me with my functional legs, or this gentleman with the cast on his leg?
It's probably his.
Probably his, yeah, that's a good, I think that's pretty good. What about if you say you made that judgment, and I keep the crutches anyway? I'm a big old jerk. Do you have to then say the only resolution to this case is by violence? Some people say yes, others say no. Because if you all witness me either taking these crutches or openly rebuke the adjudicator, and you think that the adjudicator had the correct reasoning, had the correct judgment, then what happens to me? I get labeled as a liar, a thief, and someone who should be untrustworthy. My credibility goes down. So while many people talk about might makes right, I like to think about it as might versus repeat business. If someone isn't holding up their end of the bargain, you're just not going to do business with them anymore. If they have a reputation of lying and cheating and stealing, you're not going to do business with them anymore. You might even invoke your Second Amendment right of self-defense. Bearing arms in self-defense against me, because I have such a bad reputation of lying, cheating, and stealing. Let's go back to voting. How good, well, how accurate is voting? Yes?
Just what you said earlier about, like, it's not in my best interest to resist with someone who constantly offends on that, right? Does that not just come back to, like, cost-benefit analysis?
Yeah, that goes back to cost-benefit analysis. Doing business with someone. Every decision you make is cost-benefit, including doing business with someone, including being friends with someone, including maintaining your friendship with someone. Any other questions? So let's go back to voting. How effective is voting at choosing what the will of the majority is? Right? Yes?
I would say in Canada it's not the most effective because we have to go like somewhere to vote, so a lot of people choose not to go and vote. So if you look at statistics, not everyone in this country votes, so it's not an accurate representation of the entire population.
Yeah, so in Canada, not everyone who can vote votes, so that's a problem. People who can vote or should vote don't vote. So that's an issue. They have a preference, but they don't express it. Yes?
In certain countries like Canada and the US, the voting system is that even if someone doesn't really agree with a party's ideology, they might still have to vote for them because the main opposing party is like worse. So tactical voting, so it doesn't really represent the actual like will of the people.
Yeah, so you might be discontent with all three or however many choices that you have, but you still say this one choice is better than the others. Yes?
In Canada, the winning party is whoever has the most seats, not the popular vote.
Right.
So the Liberals won the most seats, but the Conservatives actually had the more votes.
Yes.
And same with like Bloc Québécois and then the Democratic seat difference, but much more popular vote for NDP versus Bloc.
That's right. So that's an issue. In the so in Canada, we have, when you vote for a government, you're not voting for the Prime Minister. You're not even voting for the party. You're voting for your member of parliament who runs in your riding. In the United States, when you're voting for the president, you're not voting as an individual among the entire country. You're voting as a citizen of your own state. So in Canada, we have the riding system. In the United States, they have the Electoral College, which is a minority voting system. All right. So quiz is going up at noon this Sunday.
Yeah.